And this morning, we're going to kick off a brand new series called Full Disclosure. And what we're going to do is we're going to get into what Jesus had to say about money as you go and clench your wallet or your purse. Because if you follow Jesus around in the Gospels, it doesn't take very long for you to realize he talks about money a lot. And we're going to get into why he does that. But before we do that, I want to kind of explain what this series is not going to be. This series is not going to be about telling you to tithe more. It's not going to be about us manipulating some Old Testament text that has nothing to do with actual tithing and telling you this is all about tithing. We're not going to tell you that if you don't tithe, you won't be blessed. Because Jesus talked a lot about money, but he really didn't focus necessarily on tithing. Now, we're not going to get into making you feel guilty if you've been wise with your money. We're not going to make you feel guilty if you chose a really hard career like a doctor. Not the kind of doctor I am, but a doctor like the medical doctor. And you make a ton of money and you're wealthy. That's fantastic. We're also not going to make you feel shame if you don't have a lot of money. And there's no trick at the end of this series where we're going to ask you to give towards a building fund. We're not going to ask you to help us buy a jet. Listen, the current jet we have is fine. I'm kidding. Listen, we don't even have a church bus. No, we don't want a church bus, so don't buy us one. But what we are going to do is we're going to get into why Jesus talked so much about money. And really, we're going to answer a question today, and the question is this: what do you treasure? What do you treasure? Because I would argue that Jesus primarily used money as a spiritual diagnostic tool. And I think this tool is really a gift. And the reason why I think it's a gift is because there's a lot of our spiritual development that is very hard to measure. Like I want to be more humble. I want to be more patient. And that's really hard in real time to tell if I'm actually becoming more humble or patient. Now, over time, right, someone probably comes up to you and goes, man, I've just noticed there's a difference in you. You seem more patient when you talk. You're not talking over people. But in real time, I can't really tell. It's hard to see. However, that's not true with money. Because how you spend your money reveals your priorities. It reveals what matters to you, what is important. And if we go into your bank account, so would someone mind opening up their bank account right now? I'm kidding. We're going to open up PJ's in a second. But if we were to open up your bank account, and let's say we go in there and we see a vacation to Disney World for your kids. You know what? That's wonderful. Because you're making memories for your kids. And it is totally fine when you get stuck on It's a Small World, because it will happen. And you're sitting there. It's fine if you begin to daydream about the cost of this trip would have been the same as taking my wife to Europe. That's okay. You can daydream about that, and then the ride will start again. You'll go, no, this is all about my kids. But that's an okay thing, because you're making memories that matter for your kids. Unless you don't have kids, and you just really like Disney, then let's talk afterwards. And if we go into your account and we see a really nice bicycle, or we see a really nice pair of Jordans or Air Ballards, and that you bought those because you wanted to go to the next level for our Christmas project a few weeks ago. That shows a lot about what you prioritize. If we were to look into your account and we saw that you went to Whole Foods and you bought a bag of apples for $19, it shows that you care about your health. The point is that whatever is going on in our bank account, it is going to reveal what matters to us. See, you can fool yourself about patience. I can say I'm not impatient. Have you seen the drivers out there? I mean, have you been on 200 lately? I can say, no, I'm not being rude. They're just so sensitive and can't take the joke. It's very easy to justify. Very easy. But you can't fool yourself about money because your bank account, it is what it is. It's right there. It's black and white, hopefully not red. But you can see what is of value to you. And so what really matters to you? It can be found in two places. For good or bad, it can be found in two places. The first is how we spend our money. And the second will surprise you. It's what we Google. It's our search history. For real. There's a fascinating book out called Everybody Lies, Big Data, New Data, and What Internet Can Tell Us About Who We Really Are. And in the book, they talk about how one of the spaces that actually reveals who we really are is our search history, what we Google, because no one else knows that. Like, you could go into my Google search history, and you probably find some things about how do I get a little bit more hair up here. And I'm probably very specific with those searches, but you would never know that unless I told you. It is one of the areas that nobody knows, well, except the government, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. But besides them, nobody else knows what you search. But the other reason our search history is because it's done so unconsciously. Like, you'll have 20 different things you look up in 5 minutes and not even where you did that. But that is a message for another day. But I think part of why Jesus talks about money so much is because it is a diagnostic tool. And before we get into what Jesus said about money, I want to look at what informed the things that Jesus said about money. So Jesus was a rabbi. He wasn't a megachurch pastor. He wasn't a New Testament pastor. He was a rabbi, which meant he was a student of the Torah, which meant his whole view was going to be informed by a correct interpretation of the Old Testament. And so when he quotes scripture, right, when he says it is written, he is not quoting from the book of Ephesians, the book of Revelation. He's probably quoting from Isaiah, Jeremiah, Genesis, and so on. And so we're going to start with an Old Testament text that I think really would have informed the way Jesus thought about money. We're going to go to Exodus 20, verse 13. Exodus 20, 13. This is the last commandment of the Old Testament 10 commandments that God is going to give. And I think the placement of this commandment is very strategic. I think there's a reason it is the last commandment. And let's look at Exodus, what the verse says. It says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. And I may have that verse wrong because I'm seeing you shall not murder. Don't do that either. Don't do that either. But that's a story for another day. We'll talk about anger. I think we actually did a series on that. But I might have misdone the verse. But here's what our verse says. It says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male servant or his female servant or his ox or his donkey or anything that is your neighbor's. And so the last thing God tells us in the 10 commandments is do not covet. Now, at first glance, this is an interesting text because most of us today probably did not covet our neighbor's donkey. Although we are in Ocala, so I guess that actually probably is possible. But for the most part, that's not something that probably is something that we're thinking about. But that's not really what the scripture is about. The scripture, while it is being descriptive, it's primarily prescriptive. Meaning it's just giving an example. It's saying if you covet anything, which is why the last part of the verse says, anything that is your neighbor. That's kind of the clause at the very end, like when you apply for a job and other duties may arise, meaning we're going to make you do whatever we want. That's what this verse is saying. It's saying this is a list of things common to that time period. But whatever time period you find yourself in, do not covet. And in Hebrew, this word for covet, it means to be pleased, to delight, and it means to treasure something. Now, this commandment, like mentioned earlier, it is different than the others because the other ones are primarily focused on right action. But with coveting, it's about right attitude. It's about having the right heart. Because no one really knows what you covet, what you treasure. They don't know the details of your bank account. And the word covet here, it's bearing the idea that one is setting their heart upon something to possess it. And so this commandment is kind of offering us like this checkpoint. It's saying, is my heart trying to grasp for something? Is my heart looking for treasure in the wrong place? And it's interesting that this is the last of the Ten Commandments. That God in his infinite and eternal wisdom wanted this to be the last thing on our mind. And it deals with our inner person, our inner attitude, and our thoughts. Later on in the Proverbs of Scripture that many of you have committed to memory, it's out of the issue, as the heart are the issues of life. And so this text is revealing to us the call of what does it look like to have a heart for God. Now, in the Old Testament, there are a few different ways we can use the word coveting. In fact, there are 3 different words for coveting. The first is the one we've looked at, and it's hamad, and it's when we are desiring something that someone else has. The next form of coveting we'll find in the Old Testament is besa, which is a desire for dishonest gain, greed. I think that could be pretty prevalent in our culture. And the last, and perhaps most common we find today, is awa, which is this kind of selfish desire. And so when you think about this idea of coveting from the Old Testament, from the Ten Commandments, it's covering a wide gamut of things. But before we get into really unpacking coveting and why it's so influential about what Jesus had to say about money, I think it's important for us to understand what it fundamentally means to be human. And I'll explain why this matters today. Meaning, how are humans actually wired? Another way we could put this is, what is really the framework that drives us, that leads us, and that shapes us? Because here's the deal. How we answer this question is greatly going to affect how we think about the idea of coveting and then ultimately money. So for the longest time, the dominant framework for what drove people could be summed up in the famous words of a philosopher by the name of Rene Descartes. And if you studied him in college or high school, you probably know what that statement is. The statement is, I think, therefore I am. Now, this thought is actually as old as the Greek ancient thinkers, but it was really made more prevalent with Descartes. And it's the idea that as human beings, we are primarily thinking things. We are what we think. And this is incredibly prevalent in 21st century churches because we've all heard messages that go something like, if you think right, you'll be right. And we really emphasize this idea of thinking. And if you don't know the story of Rene Descartes, it's a very interesting story. So Rene Descartes locked himself in a room, probably because his name is Rene, and that's a woman's name. But he locked himself in a room because he was having this crisis of, how can I know anything? What really exists? And the story goes that he says, I wouldn't leave the room until I could figure it out. And a famous modern-day philosopher, James K. Smith, said, imagine if Rene just had one date, just one date. But he locks himself in this room, and before he goes crazy and enters the abyss of madness, he has this, wait, I'm thinking. 2 + 2 is 4. If I'm thinking, therefore I am. And poof, here comes the kind of dominant framework for, up until even today, of how we think about human beings. That we primarily are what we think. And it is the belief that, again, we're primarily thinking things. And that's why in the Christian faith, rationalism plays a huge role. That's why reason is important to people. Give me the reasons for why the Christian faith is true. Give me the reasons for why you read the Bible. And what people are saying when they ask that question is that they believe that human beings are primarily thinking things. Now, as that evolved, the next idea is that it was seen that people are primarily what they believe. And that resonates, of course, in a church context, that we are what we believe. And this has to do with faith, right? So yeah, we think, but also like when I have faith, I'm placing it in something. I'm believing in something. I'm adding to it. So Rene Descartes, right, is, okay, we are what we think. And we would maybe say in many church circles, no, we more so are what we believe. But what if neither one of those were true? What if there was actually more to the picture? Are we really thinking things? Are we really believing things? Or perhaps neither of those things are what truly drive us. Neither one of those things are what truly determines the trajectory of our lives. In his landmark book, Desiring the Kingdom, Christian philosopher James K. Smith, he says this: humans are not primarily thinking or believing. We're not, I think, therefore I am. We are not, I believe in order to understand. He says this: we are what we love. We are what we love. Let's put this another way. We are what we desire, what we want to possess, what we treasure. He said what really drives us in life is not what we think or believe by what we love. And I know this to be true because let's say yesterday you made a delicious chocolate cake and it's in the fridge or it's on the counter. The odds are the more you pass by that bad boy today, the more likely not only are you going to eat it, but what happens the longer you delay? Oh, that slice all of a sudden, it miraculously grew and now I ate the whole cake, right? I can think to myself, I should never eat chocolate cake. But that ain't going to happen. Why? Because if it's something you love, you're driven by what you desire, not by what you think or what you believe. Because we will always go in the direction of what we love. Now let's look at this for the lens of God. Because I think a lot of people would say, I think, right? Keyword, I think God exists. In fact, you probably work with a lot of people like that. I think, yeah, God rationally, that makes sense, but they're not a part of a faith community. Others will say, I believe in God. Yeah, I believe God exists, but I don't know about you. I've met my fair share of grumpy Christians. But the shift is when what I desire is what I love is being with God. Because if you don't truly love God, if you don't truly desire his presence, then you're not going to enjoy following him. And if you simply believe it's essentially what's called Pascal's wager, that you think to yourself, yeah, odds are there's a heaven or hell, I better choose this side. Let me get some fire insurance. But that's not going to last because we're not driven by what we think. We're not driven by what we believe. We are driven by what we love. And so I think the idea of a person as a thinker or a believer, it fails to do justice to the complexity and fullness of what it means to be human. I don't do things for my wife because she's my wife. I do things for my wife because I love her. And what we're going to find in this message is that what we love is what drives us. That what we love is what we treasure, and that what we love is what we will chase after. Because what drives and leads the human heart is not what we think or what we believe, but it's what we love. Which brings us to the first issue of coveting. And the first thing I want to look at is this: coveting is a hard issue. Coveting is a hard issue. If you have your Bibles, we're going to go to Mark chapter 7, verse 20. We'll see if I got this one right. Mark 7, starting in verse 20, we're going to look at a few verses here. And it says, and he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery. Whew. And then verse 22, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness, all these evil things come from within and they defile a person. And so in this passage, Jesus is going to reveal a whole slew of things. He just kind of throws down, and we don't have time to unpack each one. But notice when we hit verse 22, what does he cover? It says coveting. And then verse 23, he gets into the heart of the issue. And what does he say? All these things come from within. That at its core, when we think about the idea of coveting, fundamentally, coveting is a heart issue. So I covet because I have an issue with my heart. It's because we are looking for treasure in the wrong places instead of treasuring God, treasuring the family and the opportunities that he's given us. We are unsatisfied, so we are constantly looking for something else. And what you covet is revealing the ways that you are unsatisfied with God. That in some form, he is not enough for you. And if we're honest, coveting is something we all deal with. Nobody escapes it. I'm going to use an example of myself. It is very easy. I think it's apropos that Marty mentioned, the idea of social media, the have-nots now want the haves. Like as a pastor, that's really easy. I can look at someone else's sermon and think, oh, that sounded way better, or someone else's church, or someone else's whatever, right? It's so easy to get caught up in, oh, even if you did a great job, all of a sudden I'm lost dreaming about what I don't have. But the danger is that coveting is very much a sin that no one else sees but you. I mean, sometimes it comes out. It does. But most time it doesn't. Like that's what makes coveting so difficult, so tricky. Like that's not the case with anger. You can't you can't hide your anger. Like everyone around you is like, oh yeah, we see it, we know. Coveting, not necessarily. And that's the deceitfulness of coveting, is often we're the only ones that are aware of it. We are the only ones that know, what do we truly treasure. And that's why I think it's so important that when you know the things you have a propensity to covet, to treasure, that you get honest and authentic and you share them with other people. Say, hey, I want to invite you in, because if I'm not seeing this, if you're noticing me starting to move in this direction, please help me, because this is an area that I tend to struggle in. So an example from my own life is I'm a very driven person, which can be great, but can also be not so great. I very much can be a workaholic. And you know the difference between a workaholic and an alcoholic? One gets celebrated and the other gets shamed. And if I'm not careful, I covet accomplishments, achievements, and so I have people in my life, some are even here today, that when I'm leaning towards that, they will call me out. You know, they'll correct me that it looks like you're treasuring achievements more than Jesus. And most of us in here, we know the things we covet. We know the things we treasure. Could be someone else's job, career, money, different body, different spouse. Like, I wish my kids were like theirs. Like, the list goes on and on. But when you open up, you're inviting people in and saying, hey, help me when it comes to this. And here's why this is so important. Because if you don't deal with this, then coveting becomes the golem complex. Now, Golem, if you don't know, is one of the main characters in The Lord of the Rings. And the movie is essentially about a ring that must be destroyed because it possesses what? It possesses power. Power is something we often cover. And so at one point in Golem's life, he is a normal hobbit, and he finds the ring. He actually kills his friend for it, keeps it as his own, and what does he call it? He calls it his precious. And here's what happens over time to Golem's mind and his body is it becomes deformed. He no longer looks like his one form, a hobbit. He looks like a shriveled up beast. No longer has a clear mind because all he can see is this right here. He's so fixated on the ring. He desires, longs to treasure it. And if we're not careful, if we don't deal with coveting, we become just like Golem. That we are so consumed with what we don't have that we become stripped away of joy, of peace, because we are looking for treasure in the wrong place. And there's this famous line in the book, Lord of the Rings, and it goes like this. It's Frodo talking to Gandalf. He says, Frodo, it's a pity Bilbo didn't kill Gollum when he had the chance. Gandalf's response, pity? It's pity that stayed Bilbo's hand. Many that live deserve death, and many that die deserve life. And here's why I bring up that little quote. It's because you probably know golems in your life. And I would bet on some level you probably pity them. People who have so much good going on. And honestly, that's most of us. Have so much good going on, but they covet this one little thing. This one aspect of their life that maybe is not complete, that's missing, they feel. And so they're so consumed with that they don't experience the joy, the life, the peace of everything and everyone else around them, because they are so fixated on their precious. And that's the scary danger of coveting, because coveting is not content with just coveting. Unchecked, coveting leads to deep roots of jealousy, anger, selfishness, and pride. Because if you open your heart to coveting, a flood of coveting friends will join. And coveting cripples us. Because when we do that, what we are doing is we are holding on to our own precious rather than the preciousness of God. And here's the deal. Most of us, would say, that would never happen to me. But if you don't deal with coveting, it will consume you. And so coveting is a heart issue. And the second thing I want to look at is that coveting is a love issue. So let's turn to Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. It says, owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, murder, shall not steal, shall not covet, and any other commandments, they're summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so here, Paul is talking about love. And what does he list? Well, he lists the last of the 4 Ten Commandments. And then he says you can sum all this up in this beautiful statement that love is the fulfillment of the law. And that when we covet, what we're doing is we are putting the love of self above the love of others. So we saw earlier that one of the Hebrew words for coveting, it can mean selfish desire and greed. And in the Greek, the word coveting has 2 central meanings. It can mean coveting, but it can also mean greed, which I think is interesting that in the New Testament, the word for covet and the word for greed are the same word. And for me, when I saw that, it kind of like hit me in the gut, because when we think about greed, that's like the last thing I want to be called. Someone comes up and says, you're just so greedy. Like it just makes you feel this like yuck inside. But what the Bible is saying is that these 2 words are synonymous together. That if you covet, you're actually full of greed. And the word for covet in the New Testament is the word pleonexia. And it means to have a strong desire to acquire more and more and more, to never be satisfied, to possess more things than other people have, irrespective of need. And that when I covet, when I chase after treasure in the wrong place, I'm actually full of greed. And that's because coveting is fundamentally a love issue. That when we covet, we're lacking love. But here's what's so beautiful about Jesus, is that there is freedom in him. That there is freedom in Jesus from coveting and from greed, and it leads us to the last part we'll look at today, is that coveting is a Jesus issue. It's a Jesus issue. Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13, Jesus is going to reveal some things about coveting. What he's going to do is he's going to do that through the use of a parable. And so verse 13, it says, someone in the crowd said to him, teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. But he said to him, man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you? Now, first off, this is a little awkward. Like Jesus is in the middle of teaching a crowd, and some dude just shouts from the back, tell my brother to share with me. No social tact. And Jesus is also a teacher. He's not a judge. He's not, an arbitrator or any of those things. Nevertheless, right, Jesus still responds to him. He says, and he said to him, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And then Jesus is going to tell him a parable. Now, Jesus often spoke in parables. In fact, this is one of the most common ways that Jesus would teach. And a parable was simply, think, a metaphor or a simile. And it just involved everyday life objects they'd be aware of, and just typical things in everyday life, and then there'd be one single point from it. So, Jesus' parable picks up in verse 16, and it says, the land of a rich man produced plentiful. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns. I'm going to build larger ones, and there I'll store all my grain, all my goods, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample good laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. Now, what's interesting here is that grain in a technologically advanced modern-day silo, it depends on the grain, at best might last 3 years and at least 6 months. So this man is storing up something that even today probably wouldn't last a year. And I think there's a reason why it says laid up for many years. Because Jesus is showing us how we become deceived into simply thinking if I have more, it'll last forever, it'll make me happy and more fulfilled. But then verse 20, but God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? But then for us, it doesn't stop there. Verse 21 is really the key. It says, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. And so this passage is not only speaking about being selfish with our money or stuff. The idea that Jesus is putting forward is that coveting is really an issue with him. Because in the verse, he answers, what is life about? What's the purpose? And Jesus says life is not about what you have, physical stuff, nice couch, nice clothes, physical traits, etc., etc. At its core, Jesus is saying it doesn't consist of that. And yet how often, and I'm going to include myself, 2 hands, and if I could, 2 feet, that we do become consumed by our own desires. But like we mentioned earlier, we're not driven by what we think or what we believe, but by what we love. And Jesus is speaking directly to you and I in this parable, saying it's not about chasing treasure that will never satisfy, but being rich towards God. And here's the thing, God doesn't need your stuff. Like he's got gold streets. He ain't worried about the gold in your wrist. Like that's not the point for God. He is after your heart. And so we started today with a question, what do you treasure? And that's fundamentally what coveting is about. Where are you looking for your treasure? And the thing about coveting is that it is something that affects both of our vertical and our horizontal relationships. It affects our relationship with God because we begin to move from seeing God from a loving, caring Father to this cosmic vending machine. We put in our prayer and out comes a blessing. But then horizontally, we begin to not be fully present with those around us. We begin to not cherish those that we're sitting with because we're thinking about the things we do not have. And all human relational issues we have, marriage, friends, those we work with, those on the other side of the political aisle, all of them are rooted in various forms of covetousness, greed, selfishness. That really is just idolatry. Because it's wanting things our way rather than the Jesus way. But the Jesus way says, put me first. Those other trinkets will not fill your desire. The other treasure, when you find it and you open it up, what you find in that chest is that there's actually nothing in there. One of my favorite stories in the scriptures is Jesus and the rich young ruler. So the rich young ruler comes up to Jesus, and essentially he has this checklist, right? I would imagine he was probably tall, handsome, like Marty, and had perfect hair. I was trying not to covet over your perfect hairline, but failed there. And so the rich young ruler, he comes up to Jesus, and he goes, he's kind of like, what else? What haven't I done, essentially, right? I'm rich, I'm handsome, I'm smart, right? Everyone loves me. I follow God's rules perfectly. And Jesus looks at him and says, well, one thing you haven't done is given up all of your wealth. And the rich young ruler ends up turning away and going away sad because he had a lot. Because he was the one everybody else was coveting. But here's where I find most interesting is that Jesus looked at this man and felt sympathy. And the reason he felt sympathy is because he too was a rich young ruler. But Jesus was willing to give up his throne for you and for me because he coveted you more than his kingdom. And the issue of coveting is really an issue of sufficiency. That we're not finding our sufficiency in Jesus, and so we have to go search for treasure elsewhere. But there is nothing in this world more precious than Jesus, and there's nothing worth coveting like his love for you. And here's the secret. Not even a secret. His love is waiting for you. Take your desires of what you covet and place it on the one who is worthy. Because when you rest your heart in Christ, you find a life of joy. When you desire God above all else, when you have a lot, sweet. When you don't have a lot, lack of joy is not affected by your job, your body, your hairline, the men or women in your life. it doesn't matter because the love of God becomes enough, because the love of God can fill in a way that an empty treasure box never can. The Jewish rabbis, they say this about the 10th commandment. They say it's not really a command. It's just simply a reward for following the first 9.